Hey everybody, this is Caleb, and in this video we are going to learn about functions. And for me, when I was learning programming, functions are where things started getting really interesting and really fun for me because I felt like I could actually create things with code and get it to do things that I wanted it to do. So let's go ahead and get started with the playground. We're going to create a blank playground for the iOS target like we've been doing. And I'm just going to call this funky functions. And I'm going to save it. And let's make this a bit bigger here and pull this over. And what we need to know is that a function is basically a set of instructions that accomplishes one specific task. It's a set of rules, a set of lines of code that does one specific thing. In order to declare a function, we use the keyword func. Okay, and that tells the Swift compiler that we are declaring a function. And in order to declare a function, we need to give it a name. Now, just like declaring a variable, the first word will be lowercase, and the second, third, fourth, fifth, and so on will be capitalized. So I'm going to make a quick function that declares my name. So I'm going to call this func declare name. And I'm going to put some parentheses at the end there. We'll talk more about what these are for in just a moment. But as you see, this function uses verbs, declare name. Declare is the verb. That's the thing that it is trying to accomplish. And so I'm going to say declare name, and then to give my function a body, or think of it almost like a container that holds lines of code, we're going to use curly brackets and then press the return key, and it will set a nice pair of brackets that we can put lines of code inside. And inside this function, is called its scope. The code inside this function is within the scope of this function. That's what it's called. It's called the scope. Anything outside of it is at a different scope. Anything inside is its own scope. And anything outside of the function can't access what's on the inside. It's like it's got its own little package or its own little bundle that protects all the code inside. So in order to actually get this function to do something, we can give it some instructions. So whenever I call this function, or whenever I tell the Swift compiler to run this function, what I want it to do is to print my name. Okay? Just like that. Now let's go ahead and run the code and let's see if our function works. It's running, and nothing is happening. Why do you think that is? Well, we have written our function here, but we have not yet called it. That would be like writing out a set of directions, but then not actually giving them to the person that you want to accomplish a task. So we need to call our function here by typing the name of the function. And you can see as we start to type, Xcode's autocompleter will show it here. So I can click declare name, and then if I run it, watch what happens. As you can see, it prints out in the console and it shows up on the other side. So our function works. And you know what? This is an example of a function with no parameters. Now, do you remember that I told you that we would be talking about these parentheses? Well, we're going to do that now. We're going to write another function that allows us to declare anyone's name. This function is only good for declaring my name. It's not very reusable. And that is part of the purpose of functions, that so we can reuse code. We can write it once and maybe change one small piece of it to get it to do something totally different. Or, well, I guess the same thing, but for a different piece of data. So let's go ahead and write a new function here called func declare. But instead of calling it declare name, we are instead going to allow us to pass in a string into the function that we can then send inside the box or inside the function here and actually use that data that we pass in. So to actually pass in a string, we need to first give it a name. Give it a property. And I'm going to just use the property name. And it's going to be of type string. If this is confusing right now, that is okay. We'll talk about it really quickly. So go ahead and give it some curly brackets there. And let's talk about the differences between these two functions really quick. So this function has a name, declare name, but it does not allow you to pass anything into it. Okay? We just go straight into the function and we print out this static data Caleb. But this function has a parameter called name, and it's of type string. Now, if I wanted to use that, I could then go ahead and type print, and look at that. Do you see how name pops up right there? I can use name just like it was a variable or a constant. And now, if I go to call my function, you can see there are two options. The top one is the one we did first, and this one allows me to pass in a string value. So check this out. If I pass in the name Johnny, if I run this, watch what happens. It prints out Johnny. So I can pass a name into my function through the parameter and then use that parameter inside the scope of my function. That's pretty cool. That allows us to write one function that can do a million different things. I could pass in 100 different names and I could get a different name printing out every time. That's pretty cool. So this is an example of a function with a parameter, okay? But you know what? Sometimes functions need to do work and then basically give you back the result of that work. Functions are supposed to work for us, and that is where a return comes in handy. So check this out. What I can do is I can allow my function to accept input parameters. They can take in data, they can do something with that data, and then return it back in a new form. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a function called create full name. So let's type that, func create full name. Now, if I'm going to make a full name, I need two things. I need a first name and a last name. Now, if I want to pass in that parameter, I can call it first name. Okay, that's descriptive. That's what it is, the first name. And if it's going to be a name, that will be text data, so it should be of type string. If I want to pass in the last name, I can create a parameter just like so and give it a type of string. Now, you can pass in whatever you want. I could pass in a string, an integer, a double, and an array. I could pass all of those into the same function, but for this instance, I'm just passing in two strings. And now we can go ahead and create some curly brackets. Now, this doesn't really look all that different from the function above it. And like I said, we were going to have data come in, we were going to do something with it, and then return it back. And that is where we have return types. So this function accepts inputs, and then we want it to return a string, a single string that has the full name of the person. So in order to return that, we need to go ahead and type a dash and one of these carets here, almost like an arrow, and we want it to return a string. Now, I'll show you the importance of this in just a second, but basically what we can do is we have passed in our first name here, so we have access to that. We've passed in our last name, and we have access to that, and if we want to use it, we can go ahead and say let full name equals first name plus last name. Pretty cool. So we have now taken our first name, added it to our last name, and we now have a property called full name. In order to actually return this back to the function, we can go ahead and just type return full name. And of course, we're going to need to call it. We learned that at the very beginning of the video. If we type create full name, we can pass in Caleb, we can pass in Stoltz, and watch what happens when I return this full name. I get Caleb Stoltz, but obviously this is not good because there should be a space in the middle. So let's go ahead and let's add in a string with a space and then add that in the middle. So we're now adding a space, and if we run the code, you can see that looks a lot better. But you may have noticed it didn't print out down here below. That's because we didn't use the print function, but there's a key distinction when you return a value like this. So we returned full name, we returned a string to this function. Now we can actually create a variable or a constant, and we can set the value to be equal to this function call. So check this out. I could say let full name equals create full name. And if I run this, it looks the same, but check it out. Now I can use this property. So I can type print full name. And when I try to print full name, what it's going to do is it's going to take this function, it's going to pass in the data, return the string, and then set it to be equal to full name. Then it will actually print it out in the console below. You see that? Pretty cool stuff. Now, of course, this is one way to do it, but we could actually be even more concise. Instead of setting a property here, we could just simply return this value. So let's do that. Let's delete the declaration of this constant, and let's delete this here, and then we can just go ahead and return the actual calculation of that value. So we just have one full name property. You'll see if we run it, it works the same exact way. This is an example of a function with parameters and a return value. And just like you can pass in any type of parameter, I could have returned a string, I could have returned an integer, anything like that. Just to show you, I could type, return an int, and instead of returning the actual last name, what if I wanted to know the number of characters in the name? I could type firstname.count, and what that'll do is that will actually return the number of letters in my first name, which is Caleb. So that's pretty cool. You can do a lot of different things. I'm gonna undo that, run my code to make sure it works. And yeah, guys, this is how functions work in a nutshell. We're gonna go deeper in this course to learn about some specific types of functions and ways that you can work with them in more complex ways. But for now, functions with no parameters, functions with a parameter, and functions with parameters and return values, that's all you need to know. It's so cool. Let's head over to the next video and let's learn about something called control flow and loops. Let's do it.